All right, James, we're not wasting any time because we have one of our best guests ever. Do you want to introduce him?
Yeah, it's a high bar too. We've had Pierre Engvall on the show. Yeah, I mean, we're pleased to have on from Hockey Night in Canada, Elliotte Friedman. Thanks for joining us, Elliotte.
I'd rather listen to Pierre Engvall than me, and it's not even close, really.
Well, maybe next time.
Well, so let's just dive right into it because this is going to be trade deadline. I know that's what you're focused on. Obviously, we're all focused on. It's like I'm sure like you and I cannot wait for like March 4. Mm-hmm. But obviously, we'll dig into the Leafs. And there was something you said on your podcast with Jeff Merrick, 32 Thoughts, that caught my interest. You said the Leafs kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but you said something along the lines of, it's hard to know what the Leafs are interested in because they kind of like, I don't know, they kind of have their hands in a lot of different things. You don't know what's real and what's not. How do you decipher what is real and what's not when it comes to the Leafs?
Well, I think the one thing is that Dubas has become very good at disguising his intentions. Like there are some GMs that are vaults, like Yzerman's a vault, Lamoriello's a vault, Verbeek is a vault, although he's new. And I think the other thing too is Verbeek doesn't have a team that everybody's kind of all over right now. So I think it allows him to work in silence. Brisebois is very difficult nut to crack. And Dubas, I think, has taken it as a real source of pride to try to get into that stratosphere. And he is someone who really, really wants to be seen as that kind of a person too, like a vault for information. And the one thing that I found is very difficult to do with him is determine when he's making a phone call to say, what are you doing with this person, as opposed to I'm really interested in this person. Like one of the reasons that I'm really curious about where he's going with Meier here is I know that he is called to see what San Jose thinks. What I haven't been able to figure out yet is if he's on the level of New Jersey and Carolina, who I believe are two teams that are actively trying to get him. And so I think that's the biggest challenge with Dubas is he's very good at disguising his intentions. So you have to be very careful what you proclaim he's up to. He could make you look stupid pretty easily.
James.
You going, John? Well, I didn't know you wanted me to go. All right. This is a very professional show we have here.
It's all good.
Yeah, the Leafs competition in the Eastern Conference is looking at Meier. So doesn't it stand to reason that that's an obvious thing for them to do, is at least kick tires? And I mean, obviously making the cap numbers fit is going to be harder for the Leafs, but shouldn't they see what the asking price is and shouldn't they try and meet it, potentially even just to keep them out of the hands of some of the teams they're going to be potentially facing in the Eastern Conference?
I do. I think that, the one thing is that I've really had a difficult time piecing together what Boston is up to, because I think Boston has had their fingers in a lot of things. And I think Boston is kind of going between, we think we need to add something, but we have a really special chemistry here and we should be very careful about how we fiddle around with it. Like, I think that happened to Florida a bit last year. They had something, I don't think they were going to beat Tampa anyway, the way that series played out. But they had something really good going, and they went out and they got Giroux. And of course, you're going to be excited. You go out and you get Giroux. But I think it ended up disrupting some of the things they've been doing all year. And that's not a shot at Giroux. I just think that anytime you bring in a player of that level into a team, it's going to change on some level the complexion and chemistry of what you've been doing all year. So, like, I look at Boston. I think Boston is in on Gavrikov. And I think that that's a guy who really interests them. But James, I can't figure out if they're in on Meier or not. And like, I have no doubt also that they have called. And I do think the Bruins look at this as an all-in year. Like, we don't know what the future of Bergeron is. We don't know what the future of Krejci is. We know that Pasternak is probably going to a franchise-setting number next year. I think the Bruins know that it's an all-in year, but I think they're also weighing, how much do we change the chemistry of what we have? So I find the Bruins, aside from Gavrikov, who I do legitimately think they're in on, I find it difficult to figure out what they're doing. I think with Tampa, it's a little easier. Tampa has made so many moves that there's a limit to what they can do cap-wise, and there's a limit to their assets. Like Tampa doesn't, like I think Tampa's interested in Barbashev. I think Tampa's interested in Bertuzzi. I could see situations where they get outbid for both those players simply because they don't have the assets that some of these other teams have. So I think it's on some level, it's easier for Toronto to predict what Tampa could do as opposed to what some of those other teams can do.
Well, as far as Meier's concerned, and you kind of touched on this at some point, I think, on your pod, obviously the complication for the Leafs with him is the contract and the future and everything like that. Do you think every team that would be interested in him is thinking, like, what are we going to do if we trade for him? Are we going to sign him? And for the Leafs in particular, do you think it's just like, let's just trade for him and then we'll figure it out? Like, we'll see how the playoffs go. Or do you think that's too big, like a meatball to toss into your season and toss into your roster?
Well, that's what I would do, Jonah. Like Jonas, like I would trade for him and figure it out later. Like so much of this organization right now is what's going to happen in the summer. Why not just add one more level of chaos
just one thing, yeah.
Like the thing is, like everybody says, well, Dubas has to make a big trade to win and save his job. I don't think he thinks like that. I think those are the kinds of trades that sit on your resume for a long time. And I mean, you know us, we'll bring up those bad trades forever. And I just don't think he's wired that way. But I do think he would do that. And, you know, like that's the thing. Like I think New Jersey, if they trade for him, they want to extend him right away or at least be in a position to do it. I've heard Carolina isn't quite like that. Like they're willing to let this play out and see how it is during the summer. Like if I was the Leafs, I would look at the same thing. Like so many decisions about this team are going to be about who performs at what level in the playoffs. I don't think they should be scared of adding another level of that. Like if Meier comes in and plays great and somebody else isn't good, then you can keep Meier and punt the other person. But if Meier plays great and indicates either you can't sign him or doesn't want to sign here, like if he plays great and you give someone permission to talk to him, then you can trade him and you can get back what you got. Now, the only thing that goes wrong, Jonas, is if he comes in there and they're all awful, then you've got a big problem. But I think at some point in time, you've got to bet on your team. And that time to me is now.
You talked about maybe Tampa not having the assets to get certain players. Do the Leafs? Like the Leafs don't really, there's not a lot in the cupboards there in terms of prospects and things like that. Like, are they a team that's going to be able to step up and offer enough to get someone like that?
Well, I think the thing is, like, he's not necessarily a rental, right? Like, I take Dubas's word. He's not giving his best assets for a rental. Meier's not a rental. You know, he did the first round pick for Foligno. It didn't work out as well as anyone hoped. Like, I think the Leafs have good assets. Like, they have a first round pick and a really good draft, and they have a couple of prospects that teams like. I just think that they're only going to do that if they think they can get a term out of the player.
I get that. It's also like you mentioned, Friedge, like all the pressure on this season. It's like you're holding on to the first round pick for 5 years from now when that guy plays for you. Like what? And so like you think about like Patrick Kane, and you mentioned him in your column this morning.
Yeah.
There are reasons not to do it. And obviously you could look at the price tag, you could look at his age, you could look at the hip stuff.
Look at the game last night.
You could look at the game last night. You could also look at like the people he's played with. You could look at the situations in Chicago. You could look at last year and say 92 points. There are reasons why I would, if I was in that position, I would say, you know what? Like if we can get Patrick Kane and it costs us a first round pick who's not going to contribute to us for years down the line, like how can we not consider that? You know what I mean? Like how do you, I don't know how to break those two things apart.
You know, I think you have to judge each situation on its merits. Like the one thing, like I do not like talking badly about Kane as a player. I really don't. I think it's, because I think he could go somewhere and be totally rejuvenated. Like,
me too.
Like Jonas, on one level, I really think a lot of the problem is the realization that his Blackhawks time is over. Like, I think these guys never thought it was going to end. Never, ever, ever. And like, you know, like I remember when CBC lost the rights to Hockey Night, I'd only been there for, I think, 11 years or 10 years at the time. But it was such a thing. Like, when I got hired there, I thought I was going to be at CBC forever, working at Hockey Night in Canada forever. And like I said, I'd only been there for a decade, but the people who'd been there for a long time, like, you knew they lost the rights in October, November, or whatever it was. But still in May and June, as we were going to the Stanley Cup, you still couldn't believe it was real. And I look at Kane right now and I see the exact same thing. I will say this. I've talked to some people around Kane. They think he is determined to go somewhere else and show he still has it. Unfortunately, I thought Wednesday night was a real lost opportunity. I did. I thought if he comes out and has a huge night, then all of a sudden, like, the Kane train is steaming down the tracks and nobody can stop it. But the team is really struggling and they just couldn't do anything against Toronto that much. The one thing for me, guys, it's like, I know Kane hates it, but it's the hip. And I know that the more people have watched him play, the more they're wondering about it. I think some teams are thinking about it. If it's Kane, how could you not? But I think what it comes down to is he's got to let people know where he really wants to go. And I think some of these teams are like, how much energy can we spend on this until we know if Patrick Kane actually wants to play for us?
I thought watching him last night that he just wasn't moving the way that you'd like to see Patrick Kane moving, and that's concerning. How much of the Rangers moving early for Tarasenko was concern over just Kane's injury and where his body's at?
I think quite a bit. I think quite a bit. I think there were a couple things. I think they saw Tarasenko was a better fit. The other thing, too, is don't forget Tarasenko's cap hit is $3 million a year, less than Kane. So with retention and everything, unless you were doing double retention on Kane, which is a really tricky thing to do, you were going to have to wait, right? Because the number was higher. So I think between the number being higher and the way Kane looked, and Tarasenko and Panarin have a history together, I think all of those things were a factor.
Yeah, it's funny. Go ahead, James.
I was just going to say, you look at the trade boards on the various websites right now, and there's just the Leafs want to bring a player in there who can play on that second line left wing spot. There's just not a lot of options. So, if Kane's not a fit for various reasons and Meyer's not a fit, it's not a long list for what Toronto can look at. So, is it an O'Reilly that is next up? Because beyond that, what are we looking at? Barbashev? It's really not a very deep pool this year.
I do think, and again, I freely admit that because of Dubas is the way he is, he does make it hard. I do think, and Jonas, you've written about this at length this year, is just the fourth line and the fact that they cannot get a regular combination. I think they look at the depth of Tampa's lineup and the depth of Boston's lineup and say, if we try to play these guys over 7 games with 3 lines, we're in trouble. Yep. Like, even if your fourth line's only playing 8 to 10 minutes a night, I think they worry about those 8 to 10 minutes. So, James, whether it's a player who can go right on the fourth line or a player that moves people down and makes your fourth line better that way, I think it matters to them. And I do think Barbashev is on their radar. I really do. I think all those St. Louis guys at one point or another have been on their radar. Barbashev, Achari, and O'Reilly. And the one thing is, I think that Barbashev, I've heard he's got a ton of teams after him. It's funny. Someone said to me, "Who's got a better press agent, Barbashev or Lafferty?" Like, what's going on with these two guys? And but I think Barbashev's got a really. I think he's got a lot of teams after him. I think O'Reilly's got a few teams after him. I think Achari has got a few teams after him. Like I wonder about guys like Lafferty. I wonder about guys like I even wonder about a guy like Nick Bjugstad. I do think that Dubas is looking at it like, I have to make that line better, whether it's a big player who pushes everybody down or just a fourth liner that's better than what we've got.
Yeah, Jonas is Lafferty's press agent, aren't you?
Yeah, he was of all the guys like in that Chicago game. Yeah. He stands out, and I really like Achari for them as like a fourth line kind of guy. But one thing, I keep bringing up your podcast. it's on top of mind.
Thank you.
But like one thing you mentioned with Tampa and something I think the Leafs have lacked at times, they kind of need like more pricks. Like they need, and so like I think Bertuzzi, like even like you think some guys who are kind of like I don't know, like they're pains in the ass to play against.
Assholes.
Like, basically, like Brandon Hagel is like annoying to play against, and I kind of think if you're not going to go get Meyer or Kane, like maybe you want to try to inject something like that into your lineup in addition to like fourth line type guys.
Like I think Dubas thinks that. I do, and that's why I've talked a lot more about forwards than D lately. Because look, the questions we may have about Toronto's defense, at least he knows he's got 8 guys. Mm-hmm. Like, as long as everybody's healthy, Dubas can look at his blue line and say, "I've got 8 guys here." Because, like, I think you could do a hell of a lot worse than Jordy Ben is a guy you just have around at the playoffs in a depth role. So I think Dubas looks at, would I like to address this? Yes. Do I need to address it as much as I need to address the forwards? No, I don't think he does. But, like, I think Tampa Bay, like everybody talks about all of Tampa's great skill players, and they have a lot of great skill players, but a lot of those great skill players and the other guys who surround them are absolute dinks. Like Hedman, and I say this only as in respect, he is a prick. Kucherov, he is a prick. Like Point, he is really hard to play against. And like, you know what? I admire that. Like your best players have to be good, and they have to be mean. And that's one of the reasons why Tampa's been so effective. And Dubas knows that. And so does Keefe, I think. Like, I think they know that.
Jonas, you said that Lafferty was the player that stood out for you for Chicago. The player that stood out for me, other than trying to watch Kane, was Jake McCabe, who did not look very good. He looked like a guy who was auditioning not to be traded to the Maple Leafs in that game on Wednesday. And I mean, a lot of things were going wrong for Chicago. Elliotte, do you think that like the smoke and the conversation about McCabe, do you think that that's real, or is that just one of the guys that maybe the Leafs are kicking tires on just to see what the asking price is?
I look, the one thing I think the term appeals to Toronto. I do. I think that the idea of getting him for 2 more years, whether it's at 4 or less, because the Blackhawks retain, is good for them. But I'm just not sure that the Leafs are going to pay a first-round pick plus for McCabe. I think if they're going to do a first-round pick plus, I'm going to bet it's going to be. I mean, I could always be wrong about this, but I'm going to bet it's going to be more of an impactful player than like I'm talking about a forward. I just don't see them again. Like I could always be wrong on this, James. I really could. But I really do get the sense right now they want to spend their best assets on someone to make their forwards deeper. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I don't know. I think the other thing too is, you know, McCabe is every Canadian team but Toronto, I believe, on his no trade list. Like I don't have a problem with any of this stuff. You have the right to negotiate a contract and use that contract as you see fit. So this doesn't bother me, even as a proud Canadian. But I think if a guy has 6 out of 7 Canadian teams on his no trade list, I'm really wondering how much he wants to be up here in the first place.
Well, and I just don't know how much, to me, he really changes your defense. Like, I don't know how much he boosts it from what they have. And that's why, like, Gavrikov is kind of interesting to me. But like you mentioned, they probably don't want to trade a first-round pick for a D, and they probably don't want to do it for a rental. Not for a rental. So it's like, and then Gavrikov is going to want a lot of money on his next contract. Does that make sense? I don't know. Like, you look at what happened with what you mentioned, Sherratt earlier, and the price Florida paid, and then he gets that big contract. I don't know. Like, are teams going to be scared off by some of these guys as rentals and not wanting to pay them on their next deals, or do you just think there will be a Florida out there who looks at them and, like Gavrikov say, and says whatever?
I think it comes down to how good you feel the player is and how much you're trying to win. Like, the one thing, though, I do think, Jonas, is it's a bit of a buyer's market. Like, I do think there are teams out there that think that there's so many sellers, they're going to panic as we get closer to March 3rd. It's part of the poker game, and we'll see if that's true, but I don't know that. But I have been told by some GMs that they think some of these sellers are going to freak, and we'll find out if that actually happens. I just think though, like this whole Columbus thing with Gavrikov and Chychrun, like I may turn out to be totally wrong on my theory here, but it's too convenient to me that this is playing out in this way.
In what sense? Like the teams are like it's like they're using them against each other or something?
No, it's just like Chychrun goes out of the lineup, and Columbus is a team that's always liked Chychrun, and now Gavrikov goes out of the lineup, and we're hearing that Gavrikov, like it's intensifying around him. Like I'm not sure Chychrun would be so happy with this. I think Columbus is going to have a sell job here if this happens, but I find it hard to believe that Columbus hasn't stepped up on Gavrikov to see if they could use some of the assets to pay for Chychrun. He's got 2 years term, like. Columbus, like Goudreau is like obviously a huge exception, but Columbus tried to extend Gavrikov and he said no. And Chychrun comes with term, and that would appeal to them. And they've tried to trade for him before.
Well, in the Blue Jackets strike me as a team that doesn't want to be at the bottom for long. Like they're going to try and bounce really quickly here, right? Like, I mean, they potentially get Bedard. They got Werenski coming back. They can do something different in goal, and maybe they look a lot different next year.
I think they look at this season as unacceptable, and it cannot happen again. Yes, I agree with you.
Well, Friedge, we don't want to keep you too much longer. Is there somebody out there that you think it should be talked about more as like a trade candidate, whether it's for the Leafs or someone else like that maybe has kind of flown under the radar a little bit? Like I've scoured all these bad teams rosters and I don't know who that player is.
It's a great question because I've looked around at this. Like the Leafs have shown interest in Klingberg before. I'm not sure that he's the guy now. A guy I've wondered about, I think fits for them, but again, he's a rental, and I just don't know that they're going to pay the price that Seattle thinks they can get. But Soucy is a guy, I think that's exactly the kind of guy Toronto was looking for. Like part of me is like, why would Seattle do this? They're a playoff team, but apparently the Kraken aren't crazy about the idea of losing him as a UFA. So they're at least considering the idea of trading him and adding another defender. Like Soucy, from what I've seen of him, he's exactly what Toronto would have some interest in. But Jonas, again, he's a rental, and I don't see that. So one of the things I've tried to figure out is like who's a guy with a little bit of term that the Maple Leafs might look at either they're up front or on the blue line. Like I know they've liked this guy doesn't have term either. I know they've liked Bertuzzi before, but there's this weird thing like nobody seems to have a good feeling yet on what the rules are with him because technically you can't get into the U.S. if you're unvaccinated. So I don't know that you want, like, I guess you could always lie on a visa, but the government's not gonna be too happy with you if you do that.
He can just meet them in Tampa, Friedge.
Stay down there and not play the home games. I have to say that one of the guys that I've always wondered about with Toronto, and here's I actually thought about this the other day, and I meant to write and I forgot. So you guys get it on the pod. Is Scott Laughton?
Yeah,
he'd be amazing.
Yeah, but hang on. Like, is he what they really need? Like, don't they have David Kampf to basically do that? A third line center who's not going to get much offense. Like he's signed, I guess.
Laughton, he's
a prick.
Yeah, he's, and again, and I'll say this, like, there's a lot of rumors about what would have happened with Scott Laughton if he hadn't signed that extension, right? There are rumors he was going to Toronto. There were rumors he was going to Ottawa, but he signed and he stayed in Philadelphia. I can see him being a Tortorella player, and they're a little thin down the middle right now. So, and he's got a letter. So all of that, I'm not convinced that Philly would want to deal him. But if you're asking me for an under-the-radar guy who I think they've had interest in before, Scott Laughton would be that kind of guy for me.
And I'll push back too, Jonas. He's better offensively than David Kampf. Like he's got more elements to his game. And the other thing too is Kampf is UFA, so they're going to need somebody. Like I like that. I don't know that Philly's going to deal him, but I think he's a fit.
Yeah, I think it answers Jonas's question, the one he asked me. But again, I'm not like Philly. I think is looking for centers because I don't know that Kevin Hayes is I don't know that that's going to be a marriage that's going to last. So, and also we all know that who knows what Couturier's future is going to be. So I think it's a hard match for Philly, but again, he fits the criteria of the question.
Jonas and I have been debating, and we can close out on it. We've been arguing about the trade deadline, and you look at what's happening in the NBA and all the big names moving. Like, is there a fix you think that the NHL trade deadline needs to make it a little bit, as Jonas would say, spicier than what we're seeing this year?
Well, I wish the whole sport had more of a luxury tax and a cap. I think, I really do. I've used the word many times. It's constipated out there. And like, I have to say, like, this whole Bally's thing behind the scenes.
Yeah.
There was a board of governors meeting last night, and Bettman, like, he's telling them, look, we're getting paid for now. Nobody jumped to conclusions. And I've been told that he has indicated they're working on something. But, like, I was under the impression, like, there's a team out there that indicated to me that, I heard this from a second team, but they told me that they know of teams that have basically been told, you're going to get your money, but it's not going to be as much as you thought. So, like, who knows? Like, I think there was a hope that new NHLPA executive director, Marty Walsh, would come in and him and the league would find a way to get the cap up for next year, that they would at least talk about it. And some teams I know were really hopeful of that. But now this Bally's thing, it throws everything into a little bit of chaos. So I think actually my worry, James, is actually going to make it worse as opposed to better. But I wish we had a luxury tax league. I really do. I think we need that to make the league more exciting. I think that would solve a lot of problems. But I also want $1 billion, and I probably have about as much of a fairy tale of getting that as I do a luxury tax.
Well, and if they had a luxury tax, then you would see some of these guys on bad teams with bad contracts. Teams like Toronto could just be like, you know what, screw it. We'll just trade for Logan Couture or Erik Karlsson
100%.
or whatever.
100%.
Yeah.
100. And you know what? Like, you're telling me that some of these teams that sign bad deals wouldn't want to be able to trade them to teams that can afford them? 1,000%.
All right. Well, Elliotte, we appreciate you taking time at this time of year. 32 Thoughts, the podcast, 32 Thoughts at sportsnet.ca. There's some good stuff up there right now. You are a great one. So thank you for taking a few minutes on this silly little podcast.
Thanks, Preach.
There's no such thing as a silly little podcast, and my pleasure, guys. I can't wait till this is over in another couple of weeks.